Hey, everybody, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be talking about the 1993 murder of Navy Lieutenant Dana Bartlett.
Okay.
And what makes this case so interesting is that the victim, Lieutenant Bartlett, actually provided an eyewitness account
Wow.
of his own murder
That is rare.
before he passed away from his injuries.
Yeah, you don't see that very often.
No, you don't.
That's incredible.
It's pretty amazing. So we're going to be looking at the Anatomy of Murder podcast episode that covers this case.
All right.
And we're going to be sort of unpacking the details and trying to figure out what made this case so difficult to solve and how they eventually were able to bring the perpetrators to justice.
Interesting. And this takes place in St. Thomas,
Yeah.
which kind of adds an interesting element to it.
Yeah. So picture this,
All right.
St. Thomas,
Right.
beautiful beaches, crystal clear water.
Paradise.
Yeah. But unfortunately, there was this kind of problem with crime targeted at U.S. servicemen on shore leave.
Yeah, that's unfortunately common in a lot of tourist destinations. You know, petty theft robberies. Servicemen are often seen as easy targets.
Especially if they wander into more secluded areas.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so that is where our story begins. On the night of June 15, 1993, Lieutenant Bartlett, who was stationed on the USS Yorktown,
Okay.
decided to call his wife from a payphone near the ship's dock.
Right.
He was with two other servicemen, Michael Nentz and Patrick Ardella, who were also waiting to use the phone.
And this wasn't in like a high crime area or
This was more of an industrial area.
Yeah.
It was an old pier
Yeah.
that used to be part of a U.S. submarine base.
Oh, okay.
But being isolated, kind of made it a vulnerable location.
Yeah, definitely.
And so as they're waiting to use this payphone, a small black car starts circling them,
Oh, boy.
slowing down every time it passes.
Like they're being cased.
Yeah. And Dana sensed that something wasn't right and suggested they head back to the ship.
Good idea.
But it was too late.
Hmm.
As they turned to go, three guys jumped out of that suspicious car and immediately announced that this was a robbery.
Oh, wow.
And things escalated very quickly. One of the attackers had a baseball bat with nails sticking out of it,
Oh, my gosh.
and the other two had handguns. They demanded their money valuables. And as Dana was handing over his stuff, one of the attackers hit Nentz. He put his arm up to block the blow, and that's when one of the gunmen shot him
Wow.
at point-blank range.
So this was a brutal attack.
Yes, it was. And the attacker with the bat then went after Dana and Gardella, knocking them to the ground. Dana ended up on his knees, staring down the barrel of a gun.
Oh, my gosh.
And he heard the gun click, but it misfired. He curled up, bracing for impact, but it never came. The attacker recocked the gun and fired again. This time the bullet hit Dana in the head.
This is awful.
The attackers then fled, leaving the three servicemen critically injured. Someone on the ship heard the gunshots and called for an ambulance.
Okay.
Nentz and Gardella were badly hurt, but Dana was somehow still alive. And this is where it gets really crazy. As the ambulance arrived, a detective from the Virgin Islands police jumped in with Dana
Okay.
and started asking him questions as they rushed to the hospital.
What?
Yeah. So picture this. You've just been hit in the head with a bat.
Right.
You've been shot in the head.
Yeah.
You're in an ambulance, and you're trying to describe to a detective what happened.
Wow. So Dana was actually giving a firsthand account of the attack.
He was.
Yeah, as it was happening.
As they were driving to the hospital.
That is just incredible.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
That must have been so valuable to the investigation.
It was. Unfortunately, though, Dana's condition got worse, and he lost consciousness just a few hours later.
Oh, no.
He was airlifted to a VA hospital in Puerto Rico, but he passed away 9 days after the attack.
Oh, that's so sad.
It is. And this case had, a big impact. It became, a high-profile case. The media was all over it.
Right.
The U.S. Navy actually canceled all port visits to St. Thomas.
Oh, wow.
And it basically became an international incident.
Yeah, I can see how that would happen.
Yeah. And so the pressure on the local authorities
Mm-hmm.
to solve this crime was intense.
I bet.
So they had the descriptions from Dana and the other two victims, and they started their investigation right away. They were, scouring the island looking for anyone who matched those descriptions. But those descriptions were pretty vague.
Okay.
Trying to find three young men who fit that description in a place like St. Thomas is like finding a needle in a haystack.
Right.
And the getaway car,
Mm.
which was a small black Suzuki Jeep,
Okay.
is just as difficult to find. I mean, they were all over the island.
Oh, yeah, I bet.
And without a license plate number or any unique features, it was really hard to pinpoint which one was involved.
Yeah.
The investigation was hitting dead ends. But they were doing everything they could. They were talking to people in the area, interviewing potential witnesses, chancing down every lead. But nothing solid was coming up. And as time went on, new cases came in, and the investigation into Dana's murder started to go cold.
I imagine that's pretty frustrating for everyone involved.
Yeah, especially for the families of the victims.
Of course.
But the U.S. military, they don't forget their own.
Yeah.
And this unsolved murder, it reached higher command.
Okay.
And the director of the NCIS decided to jumpstart the investigation.
Wow.
They put together a 6-person task force to take a fresh look at this cold case.
Interesting. So this was a pretty big deal.
It was.
They were bringing in the big guns.
Yeah, and that's where veteran NCIS agent Joe Kennedy comes into the picture. He was put in charge of this task force.
Yeah.
And he had, years of experience investigating all sorts of crimes.
And he was familiar with St. Thomas.
He was.
Yeah.
Yeah, he had honeymooned there with his wife.
Oh, wow.
So he knew the island.
Okay.
But this time around, he was there to uncover the truth behind Dana Bartlett's murder.
So what was his approach to this case?
Well, his first step was to completely immerse himself in the case file.
Okay.
He spent days, going over every detail, every statement, every single piece of evidence.
So he was looking for anything that might have been missed.
Right? He realized that the key to solving this cold case was understanding what had been done during that initial investigation. But more importantly, what hadn't been done.
So he was looking for any missed opportunities?
Exactly. Any thread that could help unravel this mystery.
Makes sense.
And one thing that stood out to him was the lack of focus on the physical evidence.
Okay.
He honed in on the bullet that was taken out of Dana's skull and the spent shell casings from the crime scene.
Mm-hmm.
The murder weapon was still missing. But these pieces, they held important clues.
Right.
They revealed that, the attackers were serious about killing, the isolated location,
right,
the types of weapons that were used, the shooter recocking the gun after it misfired.
Yeah, that's a very deliberate action.
Yes. All of those details pointed to a planned ambush, not just some random act of violence.
So they were there to kill.
It seems that way.
Yeah.
And Kennedy wanted to scrutinize every bit of information in the case file, even the tips that had come in after the murder.
Okay.
And one tip in particular caught his attention.
What was that?
It was from someone claiming to have seen the entire attack.
Wow.
And even named the people who did it.
So they had names.
Yeah. This supposed witness said that he was parked near the dock and saw everything.
Okay.
He even named 3 guys who were part of a local gang, known for carjackings and robberies.
So it seemed like a pretty solid lead.
It did. It really seemed promising, especially considering the gang's reputation. But Kennedy decided to recreate the crime scene.
Oh, okay.
Taking into account the time of day, how much light there was, really trying to see if it's even possible for the witness to have seen what he claimed.
Interesting.
And guess what? The reenactment showed that the witness's story just didn't add up.
Oh, wow.
There was no way that he could have seen the attack from where he said he was.
So he was lying.
Yeah. And when they confronted him with this information, his story completely fell apart.
So another dead end.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
He was just one of many people trying to get the reward money.
Oh, so people were just coming out of the woodwork.
Exactly.
Trying to get a piece of that reward.
Yeah. The task force also looked at an anonymous letter that had been sent from the local jail.
Okay.
The writer claimed to know who killed Dana. They spent hours, analyzing the handwriting, checking prison visitor logs. But it turned out to be another dead end.
Oh, man. So they had all these false leads.
Yeah. And, those false leads were frustrating. But they highlighted a common problem in, big cases like this.
What's that?
The reward money attracts people who want to make a quick buck.
Yeah.
And it creates a lot of misinformation. It wastes valuable time and resources.
Right.
But Kennedy and his team weren't ready to give up. They knew they had to go back to the most reliable account they had.
Which was?
Dana Bartlett's eyewitness testimony.
Okay.
Especially his description of the getaway car.
Okay.
And they figured that on an island like St. Thomas, there couldn't be that many black Suzuki Jeeps.
Yeah.
Especially the specific model that Dana described.
Right.
Unfortunately, they were wrong. Those vehicles were actually much more common than they thought. However, Kennedy had a trick up his sleeve.
What was that?
Geographic profiling.
Interesting.
This is a technique that's based on the idea that criminals often commit crimes close to where they live or work.
Right.
It's all about understanding the geography of a crime.
That makes sense.
And it's a really powerful tool, especially when you have a lot of potential suspects.
Okay.
By narrowing down their search to people who own Jeeps and lived or worked near the crime scene. They significantly reduced the number of leads they had to follow.
So it helps to really focus the investigation.
It does.
Okay.
And through this process, they came across a Jeep owner with a criminal record.
Oh.
And that immediately caught their attention.
Right.
This guy was known to hang out at a supermarket
Oh.
near the crime scene.
Okay.
And when they searched his black Jeep, they found something surprising.
What was it?
Inside the Jeep, tucked away in the armrest, they found .22 caliber bullets.
Oh, wow.
Now, they couldn't prove that these bullets were from the murder weapon,
Right.
but the fact that they were the same caliber
Yeah.
used to kill Dana was too big of a coincidence to ignore.
Yeah, I think so.
This was a major breakthrough. The task force started watching the Jeep owner and his buddies, hoping to find something that would connect them to the crime.
Okay.
And during this phase of the investigation, they met someone who would be instrumental in breaking the case wide open.
Really?
They'd heard about someone who was friendly with the Jeep owner and his crew,
Oh?
but wasn't involved in any criminal activity himself. They thought this person could be a good source of information.
Oh, so a potential informant.
Yeah, but this potential informant, he didn't want to talk openly.
Yeah, I can understand that.
He was afraid of what would happen if anyone found out he was cooperating.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So to gain his trust, they arranged to meet him at a local cemetery
What?
late at night.
In a cemetery at night.
It was a risky move.
Yeah.
You know, relying on the word of an informant.
Right.
But they were desperate for any lead that could get them closer to the truth.
A cemetery at night? That's pretty cloak and dagger.
It sounds like something out of a movie. But, you know, did their gamble pay off?
Well, it did. The informant, speaking anonymously, gave them the names of the 3 individuals he believed were responsible for Dana's murder.
Okay.
Ansel Cialto, Nifa Peterson, and a juvenile whose name wasn't released. He also confirmed that these 3 had borrowed the black Suzuki Jeep on the night of the murder.
So they finally had names to put to faces. What happened next?
Well, the task force immediately ran those names through their databases, and they found out that Cialto had a history of trouble with the law,
Okay.
including a violent assault.
So he was already on their radar.
Yeah, but it was the second name, Nifa Peterson, that really piques their interest.
Okay, what about him?
Well, the informant mentioned that Peterson had been having nightmares ever since the murder.
Really?
To experienced investigators, nightmares can often be a sign of guilt, sort of like a subconscious expression of remorse.
That's fascinating. So a tiny detail like that could end up being a big clue.
It was. And it gave Kennedy this glimmer of hope. He knew that if they could tap into Peterson's psychological vulnerability, they might be able to get a confession.
Right, because in a case where physical evidence is limited, and there aren't, many reliable witnesses,
Yeah.
getting one of the suspects to talk, to admit what they did, could be the only way to get justice for Dana Bartlett.
Exactly. So they shifted their focus from gathering information to getting at the truth. They put Peterson and his alleged accomplices under 24/7 surveillance.
Okay.
Documenting their every move, their habits, their interactions. They were preparing for the moment when they would confront these men and demand answers.
So it sounds like they were building a really rock-solid case. What was their plan to actually confront the suspects?
Well, they knew they needed to move quietly and decisively on an island as small as St. Thomas. Word travels fast.
Right.
And they couldn't risk tipping off the suspects.
Right.
So they decided to apprehend all 3 men simultaneously to prevent them from colluding.
Or I can only imagine the tension as they put this plan into action. Walk us through that day. How did they manage to pull off these simultaneous arrests?
Well, on the morning of January 31st, 1995, just 1 month after arriving in St. Thomas, the NCIS task force executed their plan perfectly. Cialto Peterson and the juvenile were apprehended and brought to the Judicial Center in Charlotte Amalie.
The timing had to be crucial. They needed to catch these guys off guard before they could, get their story straight or get rid of any evidence.
Absolutely. The element of surprise was key, and they separated the 3 suspects, placing them in different offices within the Judicial Center.
Okay.
They could see each other, but weren't allowed to communicate. It's a classic psychological tactic, to create unease and isolation, hoping it might push one of them to break.
It's like a game of mental chess. Isolate the players. Increase the pressure and see who cracks first. Did it work?
Well, remember, the investigators had spent weeks gathering information on these suspects. They'd built detailed profiles to understand their personalities, their weaknesses, what might make them talk. They weren't going into these interrogations unprepared.
So tell me about these suspects. Did they seem like cold-blooded killers?
Well, they were a diverse group. Peterson was the most physically imposing.
Okay.
He was tall and stout, and initially came across as tough and uncooperative. Salto had more of a streetwise vibe. He'd been in trouble with the law before, so he probably knew how to handle interrogations. And the juvenile, understandably, was the most vulnerable of the three.
Right.
He didn't have the experience or the bravado of the younger guys.
So it sounds like the task force had their work cut out for them. You know, they were dealing with different personalities, limited physical evidence, and the risk that these guys would lawyer up and refuse to talk.
It was definitely a challenge. But Joe Kennedy, he believed in building rapport with suspects. He knew that gaining their trust, making them feel like they could open up, was often more effective than aggressive tactics.
It's interesting that connecting with someone, even someone suspected of a horrible crime, can be the key to getting the truth. Did they try that approach with all three suspects?
They did. Kennedy and his team, they had this plan to use the information they'd gathered, to establish a sense of familiarity with the suspects.
Okay.
They wanted the suspects to believe that they knew more than they were letting on.
So it was a calculated game of cat and mouse. Give them just enough information to make them think they're trapped, but also create this atmosphere of trust where they might feel comfortable confessing. How did that play out with Peterson, the one having the nightmares?
That's where their strategy really came into play. They casually brought up the fact that he hadn't been sleeping well, alluding to the psychological toll of the crime.
It was a smart move, playing on his guilt and fear. Suddenly, the investigators weren't just faceless authorities. They knew his deepest, darkest secrets, the ones haunting his sleep. Did he buy it?
Well, Peterson was visibly shaken. He wanted to know how they knew about his nightmares. The investigators, they stayed calm and simply said they knew everything. It was this carefully crafted statement meant to instill both fear and this strange sense of comfort.
Like they were saying, we know what you did, and we're here to help you come clean. It's almost a paternal approach. Did it work?
It did. As the interrogation went on, they started revealing specific details about the crime.
Okay.
Things that hadn't been made public, details that only the people involved would know.
We were playing their cards carefully.
Yeah.
Feeding him information bit by bit to see how he'd react, to figure out how much he was involved. What kind of details did they reveal?
One of the most compelling things they used was Dana Bartlett's account of the gun misfiring. They described how Dana heard the click, how he instinctively curled up, and how the attacker then recocked the weapon and fired.
That detail of the misfire had to have been powerful. It's not something you'd forget, especially if you were the one holding the gun.
You're absolutely right. It was this vivid, visceral detail, and it clearly affected Peterson deeply. The investigator saw a change in his demeanor.
How so?
He became visibly distressed, his eyes welling up. His tough guy act was crumbling.
It was the crack in his armor they were waiting for. Sometimes it's the smallest details. That can make or break a case.
And as they kept pressing, Peterson finally broke down. He confessed to his part in the attack,
Wow.
giving this detailed account that matched up with Dana's testimony and the evidence from the crime scene.
So they had one confession down, 2 to go. What about the other suspects? Did they follow Peterson's lead and admit their involvement?
Well, around the same time the task force was making progress with the juvenile, they managed to build a rapport with him and his mother. And when she realized how serious the situation was, she encouraged her son to cooperate.
It's heartbreaking to imagine a mother having to face the fact that her child was involved in something so horrific.
Absolutely. Faced with increasing pressure and, a guilty conscience, the juvenile confessed as well. He gave his own account of what happened that night.
That leaves Cialto, the one with the longest criminal history. Did he crack under pressure, or did he stick to his story?
Cialto, he was tough. He insisted he was innocent.
Wow, even with 2 confessions.
Throughout the entire interrogation.
And all that evidence piling up.
Denying any involvement at all.
He wouldn't budge. Sounds like he knew how to play the system.
He did. He knew that without a confession from him, it would be a lot harder to prove he was guilty in court.
Right. But the investigators had a few more tricks up their sleeve. What else did they have to work with?
Well, they had the guy who owned the Jeep, who was willing to testify that he had lent it to the 3 suspects on the night of the murder.
Okay.
And they had those detailed, corroborated confessions from Peterson and the juvenile.
Right.
Both putting Cialto at the scene of the crime.
So even without Cialto talking, they were building a pretty strong case against him. Sounds like justice was finally within reach.
It was faced with, this mountain of evidence and the possibility of a long trial.
Right.
All 3 suspects eventually took plea deals. They admitted their guilt in exchange for shorter sentences.
After 18 long months of pain and uncertainty, Dana Bartlett's family finally got some closure.
Yeah.
The people responsible for his senseless murder were going to be held accountable.
It was a huge victory, not just for Dana's family, but for the NCIS and the Virgin Islands Police Department. It proved the power of teamwork and persistence, and, using creative investigative techniques.
And this wasn't the end for Joe Kennedy, was it?
No, this case was just the beginning for him. It ignited this passion for solving cold cases. He went on to spearhead the formation of the NCIS Cold Case Unit,
Wow.
where he helped countless other families find answers and justice.
It's amazing how one man's determination can have such a huge ripple effect. It wasn't just about solving one crime. He actually changed the way law enforcement tackles these incredibly complex and heartbreaking cold cases.
Thinking back on this whole investigation, it really highlights the power of Dana Bartlett's eyewitness account. Even in his final moments, he was fighting to make sure his attackers wouldn't get away with what they did.
Right.
The details he gave police were absolutely crucial in bringing those guys to justice.
His courage is incredible. It's almost like he knew that what he said would be the key to solving his own murder. It really speaks volumes about his character, his strength in the face of unimaginable pain and fear.
Absolutely. Dana's testimony, along with Joe Kennedy's leadership and the hard work of the entire task force, showed just how much you can achieve with collaboration and perseverance, even in the most difficult cases.
Well, we've really gone deep on this case, haven't we? We've looked at the details, the challenges, the twists and turns, and finally the resolution. It's been quite a journey.
It has, and what a testament to the power of thorough investigation, the importance of even the smallest details, and the unwavering pursuit of justice.
I think that's a great place to wrap things up. Thanks for diving in with us on this one.